In this podcast, Shernaz Daver, executive advisor at Google Ventures, talks about the fabric and the future of organization. So, stay tuned. So it's running. So let me know when we can start.
You can start.
Awesome. So welcome everyone to Jobs of Future podcast. Today we have with us an amazing guest. We have Shernaz Daver. She's a leading marketing, business, and communication executive. She has over 20 years of experience and a proven track record in building brands and consumer perception, scaling operations team, and developing global businesses to take companies to the next level in mindshare and accelerated growth. Over her tenure, she has worked with numerous companies on a range of areas, from brand building to growth strategies to crisis communication. They include Netflix, Walmart, Motorola, Polyvore, Zynga, Khan Academy, Groupon, Cosmix, 3DO, Truvio, Metaplace, Savis, Orbital Data, Indiegogo, and Baidu. She currently serves as an executive advisor at Google Ventures. She is advisor to Baobab, a VR move animation company, Voyage in the self-driving taxi space, Kitty Hawk in flying cars, and Passage.ai and Paisa in enterprise and consumer space. Most recently, she was the global chief marketing officer for Udacity, where she oversaw the company's marketing, user acquisition, growth, social content branding, and partnership efforts. Under her leadership, the company's user base increased by fivefold, revenue to over 100% year over year, and partnerships with marquee companies like Udacity, a powerful brand. She was instrumental in changing the company's business direction from MOOC space to lifelong learning area, propelling its growth and stature. Shernaz serves as a chief marketing officer and head of investor relationship at Inktomi for 6 years. Under her leadership, Inktomi became one of the hottest internet names, reaching the valuation of 37 billion. Shernaz started her career at Sun Microsystem, where she built a brand name for Solaris, the Sun operating system, and headed up the company's European software initiative from Paris. Shernaz holds an undergrad degree from Stanford and Phi Beta Kappa and a master's degree from Harvard University. With that, Shernaz, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Vishal.
Awesome. So I think one thing that I find really fascinating about your background, Shernaz, was that when I was looking at your profile, almost every company that you have touched is either defining the future of work or workplace, or they are disrupting the current business model or the conventional business model to define how we look at technology, how we look at the future. So tell us, walk us through your journey of your background and what brought you to this point.
So I actually grew up in Bombay. I happen to have been born actually at Stanford, and then I did my undergraduate and graduate work over here at Ivy League schools at Stanford and Harvard. I got fortunate in the sense that I got to look at a lot of evolutions in Silicon Valley because I always stayed in technology. So I got to see the move from mini computers to personal computers, got to see the move to mobility, got to see the move to the internet, in which I took a part in. Also got to see the move on how everything was basically going to be on semiconductor chips, and then moved over to software, and now it's actually coming full circle, and a lot of those capabilities are moving back to ASICs and chips, and got to see new technologies like VR, like autonomous cars, etc. And that's kind of what led me overall to try and join companies that were either reinventing the future with their product standpoint, or reinventing the future, with the way they talked about their culture and the people. One of the big benefits of working in Silicon Valley is you do get to see kind of the crazy people, the troublemakers, the mavericks, but we're kind of the ones that actually make a dent in the universe, so you'd like to believe that. And so you get to learn a lot. I think through the years, there have been a lot of successes, but there have been a lot of failures. And I feel that my best lessons have actually been learned through, yes, via the failures, but also via the repeated successes.
Interesting. Thank you for walking us through that. So what do you do now? Like where do you spend your time today?
So right now, I actually spend a lot of time consulting and advising to different companies. I spend a good amount of my time being an executive advisor to GD, which is Google's venture arm. It was formerly known as Google Ventures. I spend a lot of time advising tiny startups, like they could be 6 people or larger ones overall. Areas that I'm interested in that I focus on right now is a lot kind of in the enterprise space, a little bit in the life sciences space, because I believe that's an industry that's going to get disrupted. A lot in the autonomous space with self-driving car company as well as a flying car company. And generally, just because of my background, I spend a fair amount of time in the consumer space. I spend a lot of my time also mentoring young entrepreneurs, which I actually have to say personally enjoy a whole lot.
No, I do appreciate you for that. I think entrepreneurship always needs good sort of mentors and advisors, and always the hunger is all the more increasing nowadays. So I do appreciate you spending your time there. So now let's talk about from your vantage point. I think that as I was mentioning earlier, that you have been through a lot of disruption, a lot of this disruption cycles, and so from your vantage point, where do you see the future of work happen, like taking shape, and what's your perception of that? We'll resume after a short break. This part of the podcast is brought to you by First Friday Fair, fastest AI-powered way to find your next opportunity. Check out the website firstfridayfair.tao.ai and find your next dream job. Let's get back to the podcast.
So first of all, I'm really glad you have a topic that you're focusing on this. In fact, as I was saying right before we went onto the podcast, I was just talking to somebody in the AI space exactly about this morning. So the way I look at it is there are certain macro trends that are happening in the world today. And we see them a whole lot more in the United States, but I think they're just global. So number one is we're living longer. So if you're in the United States, your average age span is about 82. And if you're a woman, it's much longer. Even in developing countries, your age span is increasing. Number two is that there is no job security. So unlike in, I would say, maybe our parents and grandparents' generation, where you got out of school, you went and got a job, and you stayed in that job for 40 years, and you got a silver watch at the end of it, and you could, count on Social Security if you were in the United States. All of that has gone. So if you look at it, the Labor Bureau in the United States says that people will change their careers every 4.6 years. In Silicon Valley, it's almost every 18 months. So given that that's going on, that's the second trend. And then the third trend that's happening is technology is underscoring every industry, be it healthcare, education, government, politics, transportation. So with these three trends, if that's what's going to happen, nobody can stop it. I was doing a presentation to senators on Capitol Hill a few months ago, and it was the same thing. It's like you and I, is sitting anywhere in the world or in any kind of corridor of power, can't stop those trends. So if that is the case, then we've got to figure out how we get prepared for it. So if you look at it overall, 10 years ago, if you and I were talking, there were no jobs really like cloud specialists. I don't think anyone even understood the word. There was no really big job like Android programmer or iOS. If you had social manager as a job, people thought that was the person that did the party, that everyone got invited to. Right. Today, they've become jobs that are very much in demand. If you look at a starting salary for an Android developer across the United States, it's $82,000. That's a big jump in what you could be getting if you were not an Android developer or if you're doing something else. But that's just 10 years ago. 5 years ago, for argument's sake, you were a young person going into school and you were staying in school for 4 or 5 years. There were jobs that didn't exist. Drones as an industry didn't exist. Right now, there's a lot of hiring going on in drones. Autonomous cars. I work at advise a company called Voyage, which is in the self-driving taxi space. That never existed 5 years ago. An area that's really near and dear to my heart is anything with genetics and genomics. CRISPR as a technology, which is the ability to do gene editing. There are a lot of jobs there. Now there are about 10 companies that are in the so-called flying car space. And that was just 5 years ago. If you and I were talking 2 years from now, I don't know what jobs there are that didn't exist when you and I are talking today. The other area that's big, that's growing right now is crypto. The amount of cryptocurrency jobs with Bitcoin, Ethereum, blockchain, all of those didn't exist 5 years ago. So if you know these three trends, I'm living longer, I have no job security, and technology is underscoring every industry, And the jobs that I have today will not be the same jobs that I could have 5 or 10 years from now. What do I do with my workforce if I'm a leader? And then what do I do as a worker are the things that we have to grapple with.
Interesting. I think that's a very nicely put, by the way. So, I think one thing that I recall a recent conversation I had with one of the executive at a chip making company, and he was telling me that in 1980s or in 1970s, when we had like either the storage disruption or the process the Moore's law disruptions, at that point, not like the technology were disrupting the industry, but they're not disrupting at the pace that they're disrupting now. Right now, almost every industry is seeing its S curve disruption. Right. So, and when you're going through your disruptive times, like you cannot think of something as stable. It's still maturing every day. Things are riling up. That so now the interesting thing is a lot of technology, a lot of businesses are relying on technology which are disrupting right now. And I think in one of my recent conversation with one of the power plant executive, he was telling me that, hey Vishal, do you want to see the madness? I said, show me. So he showed me a small boiler, and he said, let me pull out the list of all the boiler parts that boiler is using, and it gave I think about 200 some parts that was used there, and he was telling me the entire sort of system is now they're all sort of evolving. They are producing quick new versions and whatever, and it's nightmare for us to keep up what's going on. So now when you look at that vantage point of where the technology disruption is happening, and then you look at sort of how our ability to retool ourselves is shaping up, what do you see? Like where do you see these guys merge, and what do you see as a resolve of, like, can we catch up, or are the technology that we are working on, they are stable enough that we can create $1 billion businesses on these grounds which are shaky, or like what's your thoughts on that? We'll resume after a short break. This part of the podcast is brought to you by First Friday Fair, fastest AI powered way to find your next opportunity. Check out the website firstfridayfair.tao.ai and find your next dream job. Let's get back to the podcast.
Look, there's a lot of industries that are yet to be created to be, multi-billion-dollar industries. There are a lot out there. I think there's a big premise, which is kind of where we started this conversation, is how do you kind of capture these and what do you do? And I have a deep belief that lifelong learning is the way you have to do it. Because if you don't, you're just not going to learn the latest. Even for me, I am constantly learning all the time. Any field, whether it's marketing, finance, engineering, they've all been disrupted, and they're all looking at different ways to do it. And so if you don't have a mentality within yourself that says, I have to constantly learn, I think you're going to be in a difficult place. So I have a simple calculation I do. If you decide, let's decide you and I are going to live to be 70, okay? And we both graduated from undergrad, and maybe we graduated at 22. Maybe we did a master's, whatever, but let's say 22. This means that 48 years of our life is going to be involved in working. And if you and I said, all I learned when I was till 22 is what's going to take me over, that's not going to work, particularly in an industry, like you said, that is rapidly changing. So my work life is actually going to be almost 3 times, or at least twice, what my kind of childhood was. And if you put that in perspective, you realize I'm going to have multiple careers. I'm going to have multiple jobs. How do I prepare myself for it?
Interesting. Well said. So and one more thing that I find fascinating. So I remember like talking to one of the university in local in Boston, and I was telling him, hey, they were putting out a data science program, and I said, hey, it's a 2-year degree, and I was and I'm always the guy ranting about this fact that as an entrepreneur, I want someone baked by the end of the weekend, and you say that in 2 years you'll get me an executive, or you'll get me a master's student who is barely enough, they know what's going on. And I think from that perspective, I do appreciate the existence of Udacity and sort of these platform, Udemy and all. So from your stint in Udacity, and from that vantage point, where do you see the reskilling market going shaping up? Like what do you see as a result? Number one, where do you see sort of individual getting retrained that market is going? And number two, where do you see organizations getting these folks? I remember I was looking at the SHRM, two interesting slides on their deck. So one deck
Mhm.
was saying, hey, folks who come from university, they are not they're not baked, and number two, I don't have resources to bake them. And I think there was a third slide which was telling them that I we give them enough, like we give them enough autonomy to work. So number one, they are not prepared, I don't have time to prepare them, but I want them to be autonomous. So how would that resolve? Like what has been your observation, from learning marketplace, what's happening?
Yeah. No, it's a really good question, and it's what people are grappling with across the board. So I look at the lifelong learning market as a very big market. I
Mm.
also look at it as a market that's very divided. I don't think it's a market that's a winner takes all market because
Mm.
learning is very different for different people. So if you look at it overall, what people, you're right, I hear this a whole lot. People come out of university and they're just not ready for it. So what we did at Udacity was to try and take our nano degrees, just for everyone to know, it's kind of a micro credential
Mm.
that gives you the skills specific to a job within a short period of time and matched it to specific jobs. So you could do the Android nano degree and then you could get an entry level job. If you decided you want an advanced job, then you have to do the Android one and then do one after that overall. So I do believe there are going to be lots of companies that are going to focus on learning specific to a job. So I think Coursera is trying to do that right now. There's a company called Lambda School that is trying to do that right now and really focusing it on skills. What a lot of the companies are doing, it actually included, is talking to the employers.
Mm.
Let's talk to Google to find out what they really need. Let's have Googlers teach the course so you know really what they're looking for in an Android developer and then give that out there. And the benefit of a nano degree is you can be mid-career, you can be younger, whatever it might be, but it's on your own time. Then there's a whole area that's the boot camps, like General
Mm.
Assembly, etc. And those are really good for somebody who wants to kind of take a very specific, deep, immersive course for 6 to 8 weeks and basically do it 24/7. And that kind of gives you a further credential overall. There are other areas too. If you look at Pluralsight, for example, that is a
Mm.
company that just filed to go public. They do a big business, overall in the management space and in nursing. So there are lots of different areas. We often talk about it just because I think you happen to be in Boston and I happen to be in
Mm.
Silicon Valley on the technology focused ones. But
Mm.
nursing is a huge shortage in the United States.
Mm.
It is also one
Mm.
of the most difficult schools to get into. If you could do a nursing degree online, that's one of those jobs that's not going to go away. If you
Mm.
look at any economist report, nursing, career providers for later in life are just increasing all the time. There's other ways to look at it overall too. And then there are a lot of ancillary companies coming up, and they're very good too. Like they will go to an enterprise and say, let's map out your entire job spec. What are all the areas that you need jobs in? And let's see how we can reskill people. Because one of the things that happens when you're the leader of a company is you don't want to just kick out people and hire new people. It's really hard to do it all the time. A far better way to do this is to reskill your employee base. So one of my favorite examples here is AT&T. Their CEO
Mm.
decided to reskill half their workforce, which is tremendous, across the board in all kinds of different programs, including Udacity, to just kind of get them up to speed on the latest technology. So you can do it from both ends and be able to do that. I think the challenge, which I will bring up too, is do companies recognize these programs? I think that's the big
Mm.
challenge, right? It's so much easier to say, I went to Boston University and I got this, and you as an employer automatically know, okay, it's worth something. As an employer, how much is a Udacity credential worth or a General Assembly credential worth? And that's the part that's harder. I feel like in the coming years, these guys, we are going to get more credibility with companies, and that's going to change. So one of the ways I look at it is how many people in their LinkedIn profile put that they've completed a Udacity course or a Coursera course, and how do employers look at it? And that I think will change in time.
Interesting. So I think you pretty much stole my next question on that. So I do appreciate you jumping on that, and that's a very good segue into what I wanted to ask you is so when we talk about credentials, as you rightly said, right? So degree programs. So in the existence of something like Udemy and Coursera, and I can only speak about my side of the story as an entrepreneur, that many times I want someone to solve my current problem, right? Because I otherwise I won't exist tomorrow. So I not so and if we look at, say, some of the companies who are following, so like Ernst and Young and a lot of these, they said, okay, we don't care about degree, we just care about, I don't know how true they are to their word, but at least they market that, right? So they are vocal about this fact that, hey, this is something is going on. And then on the other side, I remember like talking to one of the university in Georgetown, um, uh, and we were talking about the course program and length and what and whatnot. And I gave them this idea, and they said, okay, um, sure, we'll execute this idea, but it will take us like 2 years before we get approval, right? So, and I don't even know if I will exist in 2 years, or at least that idea exists in 2 years. So
Right.
the pace in which these universities and these academic institutions sort of evolve is extremely slow. And as a business, I'm always looking at sort of talent pool quickly. So how real do you think are sort of the credential from these universities and these institutions when I need someone to solve my problem today quickly? Or like, where do you see, what's your vantage? And you gave definitely some perspective, but what do you think would be relevance of would we still be looking for credential, whether it's Udemy or whether it's this university, as a business, or would I just say, I just need this guy, and in these courses you say I've done these courses and then I'll test you on it? What's your thoughts on that? We'll resume after a short break. This part of the podcast is brought to you by First Friday Fair, fastest AI powered way to find your next opportunity. Check out the website firstfridayfair.tao.ai and find your next dream job. Let's get back to the podcast.
So it depends. I fully believe that changing education is almost like changing the church or changing religion. It's a big, old institution. If you have kids and your kids get into Dartmouth or Cornell, you're not going to tell them, don't go to Dartmouth or Cornell. Why don't you sit and take a course online, or, whichever way? You're just not going to do that. There is a certain amount of things that a university gives to a young adult that you do not get overall from sitting and watching things either online or in a group or in any setting, right? There is a whole lot of that. So I don't believe universities will go away. I think this was one of the biggest misconceptions, to be honest. I think maybe around that 2012, 2013 timeframe, where people believed the MOOCs, as they were called, were going to take over colleges. And I think that did a disservice to everyone. I think it did a disservice to students, to the companies, and to universities, overall. I do believe that having a credential from a CMU or, from a college is important. I think it is important when you're young in life to go in and have the experience and see what it's all about, because university is not all about academics. It's a lot about other things. I do think that once you get out of college, and you get your first job or your second job, and when the technology changes, you probably don't have the ability to go back to school. You probably are not in that time frame, in that mind frame. You probably have other obligations, and that's kind of, at least the way I look at it, that's where a lot of things like a Udacity or a General Assembly or any of these other schools kind of come up. It's important. The other thing that I do see is some of the forward-thinking universities are already looking at these things. So I happen to have gone to Stanford and happen to live in Stanford's backyard. They're definitely looking at these things. They know there is a population that they could do things with, and that's happening. So there is that part. So I think there's going to be a couple of things that happen. Universities will stay. I think there'll be a lot of people that look at various credentials. I think there could be a time where some of these courses might be better for people that might want to decide, I don't want to go to a community college. I want to go and do these and be in a specific area. So like I said, lifelong learning everyone is very different overall, and something that might be good for you may not be good for me at all.
Interesting. And if I'm a business, and I'm anxious about the future, how would I look at educating my workforce? Like, what are your thoughts on that?
So I have a firm belief, and I see it more and more. I wouldn't have said this 5 years ago, but in the last few years, CEOs of companies, and you can watch them when they speak, they're all talk about retraining or
Mm,
upskilling or educating their workforce. Because as you get bigger and bigger and technology changes, the best thing to do is to educate your workforce. And if you can give them the tools to do it, that's great. Companies that are large like Google, Walmart, Amazon, allow people to kind of go and learn, and then they basically reimburse it. Other companies, like Apple, have their own university to be able to do that.
mm,
And they've been doing this for years. It's just that nobody ever talks about it. Facebook has a similar program. So if I look at it overall, that's kind of the way it's going. I was talking to a company the other day, and they actually help enterprises figure out a roadmap for how to train their employees. And they
mm,
are already in about close to 30% of the Fortune 500 companies. So if these companies are already doing this and they're thinking about it, they know it's important, and they know what's going to get them ahead. A large part of the partnerships from a Udacity standpoint are not only actually in the United States, but the company has a big partnership with Infosys to kind of
mm,
train their workforce out of India. And all the companies are recognizing this, because I think, like I said earlier, first we had the mentality that said, okay, if Shernaz can't do the job, let's just fire her and bring somebody else in.
mm,
The reality is it's really
mm,
hard to bring a new person in, to
mm,
onboard them, to get them into the team and all of that. And when you look at the time it takes versus reskilling me to get to be a better Kafka engineer, for example, it's far more worth it. And I'm going to stay at the company, because if you go back to that earlier trend, people are leaving companies. You don't want them
mm,
to leave either. Walmart, for example, which I worked at for a couple of years, has a huge engineering organization under the Walmart Labs moniker. And basically, that entire workforce has to get reskilled in very different things. They have to get reskilled on supply chain. They have to get reskilled on mobile. They have to get reskilled on IT. Very, very different things than getting reskilled at a company, like Cloudera, for example.
Interesting. And one more thing that we were when we were researching about the future of work, right? So one thing that I came across is the idea of true learning. That true learning is not only just the training, but the folks that are working around you, and the on the job training, that kind of work that you get, and how it trains you as you're working. So how real is that? Like, how feasible, and how, like, from your vantage point, from whatever you have seen, how real is achieving this milestone of, hey, your co-workers would be a sort of instrumental part in your growth and learning, as well as this fact of sort of the kind of work that you do, and integrating that to your learning and goal object, or learning growth objectives, and then obviously adding you to the training. Like, from from your vantage point, what have you seen?
Yeah, so actually, I think this has nothing to do almost with learning. It's people have always said this, and research has proven it time and time again. People learn better along with peers. So I used to
Hmm.
work at Khan Academy, and I'll give you our experiment.
Hmm.
This was earlier on, and we wanted to get into the school districts. And even though it's not about lifelong learning, it's K through
Hmm.
12, it's still
Hmm.
holds.
Hmm.
What we found is that with Khan Academy, the teacher could actually spend more time with the kids that needed more help. But what they also found is if they had a peer come in and teach the child a little bit more, they did far better. And it
Hmm.
turns out that the peers around you, it's not, they tend to be more collaborative, and that helps people get ahead. And that was one of the more, I would say, interesting aha moments of the whole thing, because
Hmm.
our whole premise had often been, well, can we get the teacher? And we
Hmm.
suddenly realized it didn't have to be the teacher. If Johnny was a little bit more ahead than Anne and can get her, right up to speed on the English assignment or whatever it might have been, that helps a lot too. So that holds right from childhood. So I have this definitely a collaboration, and the peers, make it better, because taking learning aside, if you look at any successful company, it isn't built up of singular individuals, even though we
Hmm.
like having a belief that it's all the founder. It's a team of people They all seem to work together either as a machine or some way create magic and move the company forward.
Interesting. And in your background, you have worked with a lot of companies in their early infancy to all the way to their unicorn status. Like, what have been sort of your observation on some of the things that these companies did right when it comes to sort of empowering their workers, and what are some of the best practices that you could share from your experience?
Yeah. So I got to work with a lot of different companies at different stages. I'll tell you the thing that matters the most in hiring teams, and I spend a lot of time on this topic, is hiring the right people. And a simple way to look at it is A players will hire A players, but B players will hire B players, and they'll also hire C players. And the B and the C players bring your company down. They're almost like this thick clotted cream on the top, and you can't move. And then what happens is your A players leave out of frustration because nothing's moving, and you're stuck with the B and the C players. So when you're hiring, choose carefully. Don't choose rapidly because you believe you need to have a person with two eyes and a nose, and then that's going to work. Because I would say, at least in the United States and in Europe, it is very hard to get rid of people, and you want to be careful there. And that's important. I very often, when I say this, my startups will go, yeah, but we really need to move fast. And I go, great, then go hire a consultant. They're probably really good. They're probably smart, and you can fire them at any time. So choose carefully with who you're hiring. I got fortunate to lead a lot of groups, so I will definitely hire that way. The second thing that I will always tell people is don't judge a person by their resume. Because very often what happens is the resume makes you look amazing. You're supposed to, but kind of go through the depth of it. If you are a 20-person company that's doing a very hard AI technology and you want to hire a general manager for whatever reason, and that person comes with this incredible title, VP of Strategy, Senior VP of et cetera, from AI on Wall Street. My God, you're going to fall in love with that woman because the resume looks good. When you bring them in, chances are they've never worked at a 20-person company. They are used to having two assistants, and so there's not the right fit overall, and it's probably not going to work. And I say this only because I've been through this experience multiple times, so this is a true story, just kind of, got it in a little way. So you want to just be careful. So I always tell people, don't judge a person by their resume. That can let them open the door, but spend time with them. And the third thing I will say is hire people that don't look and think like you. If I'm leading a group, I should not be hiring everybody from Stanford. I just should not. Even though it sounds great, chances are we'll probably think alike, and that doesn't help. I think in the early stages of a company, to get a prototype up and running fast, yes, hire people like you just to get it out. But then after that, which is basically after the first 4 or 5 people, hire people that don't look like you and that don't think like you. So my best successes from a business standpoint have been with teams that are diverse. And that's really important.
And so what are some of the hacks? Like, what are some of the, if you can share some of the best practices that you have used over the years to hire someone, or at least found your best hires? Like, what are some of the ingredients of that process that you could share for our listeners?
So I'll definitely look at people outside of my immediate network, just overall, and try and see what that is. Once I hire the people, I have to empower them. So I tend to want to hire people that are smarter than me in a specific area. And this is where leaders, I would say, very often fall short because they're very nervous about hiring somebody smarter than them because they feel that then they're going to take them off their perch. And the way I look at it is I should be hiring people, all of which, in some way, shape, or form on my senior team should be groomed to take over my position. And it's a little bit of a different mentality. So if I am hiring a growth marketer, he should know far more than me in growth marketing. If I'm hiring a media person, they should know far more than me overall. Once you get them in, you need to empower them. You need to let them have enough rope, so to speak, that they can kind of go to the edge, and then you can kind of have some, way to catch them, but let them take risks, let them experiment, and understand that experimentation is a good thing. And if it fails, it's also a good thing. Because if you constantly experiment and you're constantly succeeding, something's
Mm.
wrong. You're not experimenting, right? So I do have a big belief in that overall. I also do believe that everybody has to move to something bigger than their just
Mm.
current job. You have to believe in life that you're making a dent somewhere. At least that's the way I look at my life, and maybe that's not the best thing, but if they're not going on a journey that's far bigger than them, you're going to lose them. There have been so many studies done talking about how customer service reps, for example, are probably one of the most unsatisfying jobs. It's a painful job. You're just getting people that are complaining.
Mm.
If you let the customer service person know something personal about the customer, their entire demeanor changes because they feel they're doing something more than just answering the question. So I feel like that a lot. And then one of the last things I often will tell people is don't look at your career with me as a ladder. I come in as an
Mm.
associate, then a junior associate, senior, then manager, director, VP. I think the world is changing. And if you think of your career less as a vertical ladder, but more as a jungle gym, where you kind of
Mm.
get broad experience across areas, that helps a lot. It's a little bit like I think you and I were talking about before the podcast, is get a lot of experiences and then you can do a whole lot. And I did this in my career. Instead of going up a vertical ladder, I decided to go to Europe and start a program overall there, which forced me off the career ladder in headquarters, but helped me get broader experience. And I think that's really important too.
Interesting. And you talked about jungle gym, and I think whenever I hear jungle gym, I think one of the things that I use very often in my pitches. So when companies are really early in their inception, they are pretty much like jungle gym. Like, so managing people, managing sort of culture, everything is jungle gym. Then you pretty much, as you grow, you get into this so-called off-roading. So some space is going on, but still and then there's a highway. Then you just have to scale, and scale. So you have in your journey, you have taken the companies through all the three verticals. So what are some of the changes that you observe, or changes that, or some of the best practices that you could share while you are transforming from, say, or a very incepting concept company to a multi-billion-dollar corporation? So what are some of the thoughts that you could share?
So some of the things that do happen along that journey is your entire workforce goes away and it comes up again, and that's okay. The people that were the best when you were a 10-person company, chances are probably not the best when you're 150 and probably not the best when you're 1,000. And that's okay. It is okay to flip over your entire workforce if need be and be able to do that. And you have to know that because also very often, some of the best engineers in the world don't want to manage people. They are incredibly good at creating new technologies and innovating. They don't want to just keep iterating. And very often, when you become big, it just becomes more of a management challenge. So I think there's a large part of that. Core things that hold, and I will share this, is what the founder believes in. So when a founder starts a company, it is their baby. It is their idea. They're the ones who've been eating the ramen noodles for God knows how many nights. They're the ones that have been begging to get venture funding. It is their thing. Whatever happens, whether you're 6 people or you're 6,000 people, the founder's values and vision should still hold. Even today at Walmart, which is a huge company, it has over 1.5 million people working there. The founder's vision, who is no longer even alive, Sam Walton of EDLP, which is everyday low prices, that still holds. So as you kind of go through a fabric of where you are from when you're really tiny to as you're scaling is really important. Netflix, which is considered to be one of the most incredibly successful companies, the values of what that company started out with Reed Hastings, it still holds. And that's important. And I think particularly important as you scale is your culture. And I feel sometimes we forget about it because we're just focusing on getting product out and our customers. But really, your most important audience as a leader is your employees. They're the ones that have decided to come and work for you. They're the ones that get up every morning and have to be excited for what they're coming to believe in. And that doesn't change regardless of where you are. And those things are really, really important. So I cannot stress how important it is to have weekly meetings with your entire company, whichever way you do it. Whether you're large or you're tiny, it doesn't matter. Your employee is your core asset and most valuable, and that's the most important thing to look at. And that doesn't change overall.
Interesting. And you also have a successful career as a marketer, right? So you have been leading marketing for a lot of these companies. So from your marketing vantage point, when you see sort of this growth or this transformation, how does like, and it's your job to sort of understand the culture and then connect it with the client somehow, and sort of create this bonding. So what have you seen are some of the best practices that companies who have actually grown from a very tiny entity to a big corporations, how do they end up discovering and communicating that cultural values that ultimately not only got them some lifelong clients, but also a constant stream of talent that they need?
Right. So a lot of it, like I said, actually has to start from the founder. And generally, most of the companies will have the founder in some perspective. If you look at successful companies, the founder is either the chairman, they might have a new CEO, or they're still the CEOs, overall. And that has to transcend. And then there's also just, very logical, basic things to do. And I'll just give tactical examples. Have a program like Slack run in your office where people can have a lot of conversations. Have groups that are connected to certain interests, overall. Have a weekly meeting where people can air their questions, whatever they might be. That's really important. And also live your culture. There's no reason to say something, but then not follow it. What's going on right now, I would say in my industry, or largely the industry I work in, which is tech has become a formidable industry in the last 20 years. And it has created a lot of wealth in a very short amount of time. And most of us remember it, overall. And so what's going on with leaders at companies is now it's not enough just to be the leader of a tech company. You have to have an opinion of things in the world. You have to have an opinion on immigration. You have to have an opinion this week on Pride Week, because that's what's going on right now. You have to have an opinion on tariffs. That never happened a few years ago. So suddenly, as the leader of a company, you're not only talking about your product and your employees, you have to have a view that may or may not agree with your entire workforce. But I do feel people that are transparent and honest about it and say, this is what our view is going to be, and this is how we're going to manifest it, you get a lot of respect from employees in being able to do that. And, and looking at the marketing person's job, it's more of an idea of how do you get it out there and communicate it in the best way. Like you'll see this week in Silicon Valley, I think a lot of websites will do some recognition of Pride Week, overall, just because for us in the Valley, it's something that people care about and people have an opinion on.
Interesting. And I think one more thing that I was thinking about, so we both are blessed with the ecosystem that we live in is very tech savvy. So they understand where the technology is going, what and how are it disrupting the business landscape. If you see many of the great organizations which stays in, say, either Midwest or the areas which doesn't have access to these sort of so-called amazing technological behemoth corporations living close by to get the perspective. What is the hope for them? Like, what do you suggest these companies do to keep themselves at pace with what's happening? What's your thought on that?
Well, I think a lot of them are doing it. I mean, really, I think we are myopic in Silicon Valley, thinking that we know everything. I mean, AT&T is an amazingly innovative company, and it is nowhere headquartered either where I live or in Boston, at all. I mean, they're doing it. Accenture is doing an amazing amount of things. It's Walmart is headquartered in Bentonville, and they're doing a whole lot of things overall too. So I think what happens, particularly with media and with social, is we kind of focus on the two coasts. But I think there's a lot of really interesting innovation and really interesting learning that is going on definitely in the Midwest states and things of that nature overall. And they are the ones that have the big companies. If you want to change the face of the Fortune 500 companies, You're going to talk to Coke, Kohl's, Walmart, Safeway,
Mm.
Pepsi. That's where you're going to go. And those are the guys who are the customers. And that's what the beauty is on the whole thing, is they're the ones that are taking your technology and actually distributing it.
Interesting. No, I think that's a very good perspective, and I do definitely agree with you on at least some of these unicorns. They exist at a very remote location. There. But I think many of the conversation that we had I think I remember I did a year and a half long sort of touring cities in US and meeting entrepreneurs and trying to understand what's going on. And we met a lot of mid-size and mid to large size and in some cases small size businesses. And we spoke to them and we realized like a lot of these guys are very laid back in culture. The culture is very heavy, very strong family culture and whatnot. And they don't have too much visibility into some of the practices that we take it for granted at least in my course side. So I definitely point them to, hey, why don't you, many of the, it's funny, like I was talking to an IT manager and I was talking to him about TechCrunch. He said, what's TechCrunch? So that's hard to imagine, right? So that today anyone but those guys exist. So what do you suggest those guys, what should they do?
So it's funny you should say that. I always also sometimes look at it differently and going, well, what should we do to understand what they're going through?
Beautiful. Yes.
Overall in doing it. There's a mix of, both of it, kind of coming out. If you look at the automotive manufacturers that are now calling themselves the mobility services business, apparently, they're all out. Ford, GM, none of them are kind of, located here. A lot of the bigger companies are doing something interesting where they're putting a lot of their labs actually in Silicon Valley. So I came into Walmart because of an acquisition, and it was Walmart's first acquisition in the technology space. And we created Walmart Labs, just kind of where a lot of their developers sit right now. And since then, a lot of companies have created kind of lab operations in Silicon Valley to kind of get access to the best talent and innovation. So, Ford has one, GM has one. I think a lot of companies out of China have one. And a lot of them are doing that to kind of get the best of Silicon Valley. I would say one of the good things that's happening is a lot of people from the tech area are also going and funding companies outside of the two coasts. So Steve Case, who was the founder of AOL, is very prolific in this area of trying to do that. And in fact, they have something called Startup Grind, which is a conference here that happens, I forget, in the February-March timeframe. And I spent an afternoon talking to female entrepreneurs, none of which were from the coast. And those ideas are great. And if you have the ability to nurture them, it's going to do tremendously well for the country and the GDP in general.
Interesting. Actually, so it reminds me of, and by the way, well said on the fact that we should be doing something for to solve that problem. Because I remember like the thing that I got hit by was one of the conversations with one of the executives in one of the city, and he told me that, hey Vishal, you guys are East and West phenomena. I said, what do you mean by that? And his perspective was, hey, you guys come with your fancy blah 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 jargons and then you throw it at us and it's hard to whatever. And I was pretty much trying to understand how much they use data in the decision making. I was doing that research. And then I said, hey, what can I do to solve that problem? So he said, go figure it out. Like you have all the answers somehow. Can you so I told him that, so long story short, they said, why can you create a platform in which education comes to us before we get into the education? And from that perspective, and I think that that was like 4, 5 years, 6 years back. So I'm hoping that like Udacity and all that, like they fill that void pretty nicely, right? Because previously it was very difficult to figure out what's going on, and right now things are really, really, really cool on that perspective. So that's pretty awesome. So now, as if we move on to sort of if I'm a business today, right, and I want to sort of future proof myself, what are and if you wear your marketing hat or marketer's hat, what would I do to sort of ensure that I can compete when it comes to talent with, say, companies like Google and Facebook and whatnot? what are some of the things that you have seen in your experience in helping out a lot of interesting startups they do to successfully compete on a talent market?
No, it's a popular question right now. Talent, I think, in engineering is really, really hard to get right
Mm,
now. But the way I look at it, if we look at the world that says, okay, it's only going to be these big companies, then
mm,
the entire culture of America just kind of goes away. The whole country was built on the idea that you had the ability to have all of these kind of small companies come up. And one of the biggest things that we find is it's very often hard to compete on salary and compensation. But
mm,
if you're not hugely disparate, which you really should not, you should try
mm,
not to be, and you can convince people on the mission and the fact that they will have a bigger impact at the company, that will often drive people. Because when you're at a big company, chances are it's big and there's lots of people over there and everybody's going to be able to do something. But the impact that you have in I would say 50-person company compared to a 2,000-person company is a lot different. And
mm,
so you tend to hire people that believe they can make a difference and have the ability to do it. One of the most interesting things that actually does happen in the Valley is a lot of people that come from the companies that you're mentioning have already had a hugely successful run there. And now they want to go back to something smaller and they want to do something different. And I'll give you an example. So some founders of some of the more successful companies, a lot of people are going into the life sciences space, which I love because the way you look at it is the entire area of health, I would say, is changing because of data and the fact that the cost of computing is coming down so much and the
mm,
ability of having biology connect with computer science is incredible. So some of the best companies out there right now are being created by technologists. And they really are kind of coming out of the area that says, let's do something in the health area. So a company that Google Ventures has in its portfolio is called Flatiron. And they actually were taking data to kind of connect it for oncologists. And the two people that
mm,
started it were actually ex-Googlers. They weren't out of life sciences. And the company just, had a very, exciting announcement where they got acquired by another big pharma company called Roche. But if you look at that area, overall, some of the best talent is going there. I would argue the other areas the best talent is going into is actually learning. Because I talk to a lot
mm,
of startups right now, and they're not being founded by first-time entrepreneurs. They're
mm,
actually being founded by people who've already been successful, and they're going and going, wait a minute, this whole industry is broken. It still has a lot of work to do. What can we come in with and be able to change it? And so there's a little bit of a difference, going on overall, and that's interesting. One of the early employees at Netflix called Neil Hunt, who actually did all of their production, has a company in
mm.
the life sciences space that he just started with some really interesting people. So I think there's a little bit of a change going on too. I don't know whether it's because we're becoming older or because we're
Right.
seeing problems in a different way, but they're all good.
That's very interesting. And if like, what are some of the trends that you come across in your journey that you hold very dear to when you when you think about where the future is taking us? Like, what are some of the things that you follow that helps you understand? Like, if I want to understand where the future is for organization and workers, what should I follow? Where should I look for that?
You mean like what you should read or just in general?
So yes, so in general, like where should I look for signs to help me see where the future is taking us?
It depends, I would say, in which industry you're in. And I think that's important to understand because, where the future is taking us in life science is very different from where the future is taking us in enterprise computing. So, whichever area you're in, learn on those areas, overall. I would say there are some, in my opinion, there are some general macro trends. And of course, I tend to be biased too. I do
Hmm.
believe health and life sciences will change a lot. I do believe that we will figure out how to cure cancer, maybe not per se in my lifetime, but probably in my kid's lifetime. I do believe that. I do believe that even today, we can control the spread of cancer far better than we could control it 10 years ago, which is incredible overall. I think the ability to do genomic sequencing of your genes and be able to do it fast and to do gene editing with things like CRISPR are going to become more commonplace. I think that whole area is fascinating. And I think that's a macro trend because whether you're the CEO of a consumer company or the founder of a cosmetics company, you're all going to die one day or, you're going to get sick. So the healthcare stuff, definitely. I do also think there's lots of innovative things going on just within the healthcare system, like companies like One Medical. How do you do patient care? How do you do wellness? I think that whole area is fascinating. And I would say, where we've gone with life sciences from a technology standpoint in the last 10 years, I don't think we've hit that probably in the last 100. There's a project that I was slightly involved in from Stanford that allowed you to actually just detect if you could have skin cancer via just kind of photographs and putting it against AI and ML databases. So there is that big part that I fully believe in. I think learning, as we spend most of the conversation on, is ripe for change because we've only talked about the US, but there is an entire world out there of 7.7 billion people. And somewhere in life, they will have to be learning. So if you ask me what I would love for learning to become, I would love for it to become almost a daily habit that you don't notice. So Larry Page says this really well. It's like something should be a habit like brushing your teeth every day where you don't think about it. So if the next generation could have something on their phone where they were constantly learning, but they didn't know they were learning, that would be huge. So for example, we automatically do Google searches without thinking that we're searching. It's just a fact, we just do it really quickly. And I think that's going to happen with learning. And I think that's what will make it incredibly successful, where there'll be a mentality that says learning doesn't stop. It doesn't stop at 22. It doesn't stop at 27. It doesn't stop at 10. And everybody has access to it. So because I grew up in India and spent a lot of time in Asia, I fully would love for any little girl in a village in India to have a Samsung or an Android phone and be able to learn something. If she could just even learn English, her economic power grows tremendously. And you can do all this, and that I see happening in the next few years, with companies like Duolingo and things like that. So I think learning is a big space. I think currency is a big space with crypto. I know there's a lot of questions around it, but I think that's a big area. And I think, I think transportation, I think anything that changes your daily life is a big area. And I do think we see self-driving cars here. I fully believe they're going to happen very soon. And all of these things, I just see them going to the world very, very quickly. Just overall, it's like phones, so many countries in Asia just moved over to mobile phones. They just forgot about the landline totally. And I think those things will happen.
Interesting. And thank you for sharing your perspective on that. I think one more area before we get to the last part of the conversation. We hear a lot of brouhaha about AI taking away jobs. So from what is your perspective on the crosshair between the AI and human workers? Like what do you see happening? What's your vantage point on the future of AI and humans?
I'm not an expert here. There are a lot of experts that have weighed in on it.
Right.
I think we've always had this thing about whether robots will take over our jobs, because I think we morph AI into something human. And robots will take over jobs probably that are physical, like baggage handler at the airport, Yeah, okay. But the truth is, Vishal, today robots and AI are in a lot of what we do. Your refrigerator, chances are, your Nest thermostat, they're all doing something with AI. The way we look at it taking over is because we kind of make it a human face, and that's what we're worried about. But I have a belief in humans. I believe that humans are creating the AI, and if they want to create the AI to take over, that could happen, and they have the ability to do what they can with it. I also really believe, and a lot of AI experts say this is very far along out there, overall. It really, really is. I think there's been huge strides with Go and all of those areas. But I think humans are special. Humans have things like common sense and they have emotion and things like that. And AI doesn't have it yet.
Interesting. And by the way, thank you so much um, for an interesting conversation on this future of work. I do appreciate that. So now we're almost at the tail end of the conversation, and I think in this part I want to spend a few minutes on your journey. And I think one thing we ask our guest with this, like in your journey so far, what are some of the tenets that has helped you stay successful? Like what are some of the things that has really helped you be what you are today, that you could share with our listeners and viewers?
So first off, I'm not sure I'm really successful. I don't see it that way. And I think that's an important tenet because I think when people see themselves as being really successful, that's kind of a problem. I think I have a lot more to achieve. But I like I look at things in three categories. I like being curious. I love learning, period. I mean, if there's a new industry, I'm just going to learn about it. And if I can't get the right people to teach me, I'm going to find somebody else. I think that's important. I like breaking glass. It's just a lot of fun. I think some people are more, I'd like to just stay in and maintain. I'm not very good at maintaining. I like breaking or building, whichever way you look at it. Sometimes I break glass and it's a total failure, but at least the journey was fun. For me, a big part of my success has been the teams and the leaders that I've been fortunate to work with. I got fortunate to work with incredible people at Sun, incredible people at all of the other companies like Netflix and Walmart and even startups, overall, and that has been tremendously helpful. I would say the other part is just execution. I think people have an idea a minute, and you and I in the 60-minute conversation could have 60 ideas. It makes no difference if you can't execute brilliantly on one or two of them. And I think that's an important way to look at it too.
Interesting. And what are some of your favorite reads that you would recommend? I think one thing that we found really exciting, and I find really exciting, is that the reading choices the guests make, and this really helped me understand their journey, and definitely love to know some of the interesting read that you want to share with our listeners and viewers.
So I read a lot. So this could be like an hour conversation. So I'll just tell you so I want to. So my big belief is the only way you can learn is to keep reading. And I say this to people all the time. I go, lots of things will change. The way we communicate has changed, right? You and I will either text or do email. We will barely have a phone call. The way we view things has changed, right? We used to have DVD, first we had TV, then we had DVDs, and I have a daughter right now who has no idea what a DVD is and basically believes everything should be streamed and on demand, and that'll change. So all of these behaviors have changed, but reading hasn't, and I don't think it will. So I love reading. I read voraciously in the morning at any time. So I'll tell you just the recent books I read, which maybe might be helpful. So there's a book called Brotopia, which is written by a good friend of mine, Emily Chang, talking about Silicon Valley and the lack of, women's presence. There's a book called When, which I thought was really interesting. I think it's written by Pinkett. And the idea is, could you take timing and make it scientific to prove certain outcomes? Which I thought was fascinating, and I started using it. I just finished reading Bad Blood, which is the Theranos story on, a company. And that was interesting. The book that I really have loved reading is Shoe Dog by Phil Knight from Nike. It's a great book. I have to say it's a great book. And then John Doerr just has a book called Measure What Matters that I actually just finished reading yesterday, so it's just top of mind. And that's an interesting book only because I think it relates to the conversation you and I were having of how do companies become successful. So you could have the vision, but you really need to have an execution machine and have things that measures outcomes. And I would say John does a really good job of bringing that up and giving really good case studies overall on it.
Interesting. Thank you for some amazing list on that. Definitely, it adds to my list. So now, before we part ways, if you want something that for the listeners and viewers to take away from our conversation, something that you think that it's important. So what would that be? What would you like to share as a closing remark for our listeners and viewers?
So I would say, given the audience that you have, which is filled with people that are looking at really interesting ideas and startups, there's a lot that needs fixing in the world today, and there's a lot of things that I cannot even imagine that hasn't yet been invented. I think we're just starting to scratch the surface. So I would really say, stay curious, stay relentless, and make a dent in the universe, because at the end of the day, kind of create and collect a lot of stories, because, the person who dies with the most stories probably wins.
That's a beautiful closing, by the way. And thank you so much. And as I do appreciate you being very generous with your time and candidly talking about your journey and helping us understand your perspective on the future of work and future of organization. I do appreciate that. You're always welcome back on the podcast. And thank you again for your time.
No, thank you so much.
I thought I was sick of home, but actually I was homesick. Never really knew that I would have to grow up so quick. I'm so uncomfortable, don't know anybody here. Just a couple dudes that I met once, that's it. And I go into the booth feeling nervous. Got butterflies in my stomach like I'm so worthless. Is the mic on? I don't know how to work this. Inside I'm breaking down, I hope I'm not up on the